yeah, that is not.
I don't think you understand what MC is. Because Liberia is one of the partners, as is Georgia. Those are not the same.
Well, and this is, okay, and I think it's basically defunct now, and I did not invest in it the way that it can, but those conversations about the fragile state in
Can I introduce you?
Good morning. And then also, there are many.
No, my pleasure.
Right, good. Right.
I think we better.
But, you know, so it's just like, so it's not a good fit, but I do still think it
I'm in Georgetown.
like some things.
Selfreliance service and running a master's program.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Stimson Center. My name is Brian Finlay. I'm the president and CEO here at Stimson. For those of you that are new to us, and I see some new faces certainly in the room, you may be wondering why an organization that has principally for the past 30 or so years been dedicated to issues of international peace and security has convened this esteemed, and an esteemed group it is, of leading voices in the development space here today. Well, I will answer that hopefully in a logical way for you. Increasingly much of our work, and this will come as no surprise to any of you, and I suspect it will come as no surprise to those around the table, that we are recognizing that the field of international security and that of development are increasingly intertwined in virtually all of the work that we do, protecting civilians in conflict, hard security, proliferation issues, weapons trafficking, environmental, climate change issues. These worlds truly are colliding in new and heretofore ways, I think, that many of us have not well understood. This is also the basis of the New Majority Program. It's your host here today. The New Majority Program here at Stimson is looking at ways to engage middle-income countries in sustainable ways in essentially a post-aid environment, and how we engage them, of course, impacts not just economics, development, but also the security relationship between countries. It is led by your host and our maestro today, Bob Berg, whom I will introduce to you in just a moment. I should also say that we are excited that you are all part, though you did not know this when you arrived, of an experiment for us here at Stimson. We have opened up what would normally be an intimate roundtable setting, hence the odd configuration of the table, to a wider audience, not just you in the room, but also those, the event I will tell you is being live streamed, which is not abnormal, but this event is also going to be recorded and polished in a way that can be circulated to a much wider audience at a later date. You will all have much more beautiful hair, and you'll look all much taller once we finish
Ungar.
Sorry, that was not a slight.
No idea that.
And with that, I will introduce our host here, Bob Berg. Bob is a distinguished fellow here at Stimson. He directs our New Majority work. He has had a remarkable career over a number of years, both at USAID, ultimately at the UN, and I will not go over his long bio because we only have 2 hours. But with that, Mr. Berg,
Thank you.
I give you the floor.
Thanks, Brian, and thank you for providing a welcoming and friendly home for this initiative. So here we are with President and listening in a leadership roundtable, and you have to kind of imagine this as a round table. I mean, Washington is filled with desires to look differently than it is, but think of this as a round table. Some people say that we're prepared for everything in life except success, and maybe that's true in international development. I've worried a long time about what happens when countries are successful enough that they don't need concessional assistance. We now have 106 countries classified as middle income. Some are lower middle income. Many are mid and upper middle income. And many are aid recipients now. 30 years ago, Ralph Smuckler, who was then head of international programs at Michigan State University, David Gordon, who later became head of policy planning at State, and I ran I don't know if it was the best exercise on U.S. third world relations, as we called it at that time, but it was the biggest exercise. And we talked a lot about what should happen when a country graduates from aid. Is there a brass band? Do you get certificates and medals? Do you then say, like when you graduate university, well, now you're ready for a higher level of relationship. Now you're open up to new opportunities, or not? Well, today that same question is before us with more impetus because the administration wants to accelerate graduations. We're not here to question if countries should graduate, but what happens when they graduate. It's terrific that with the help of George Ingram here and others, the Development Finance Initiative is moving pretty well on the Hill. So maybe some additional investment will flow to a number of middle-income countries. Let's assume this discussion that initiative passes. But what else should our relationship entail? Do we or don't we have a national interest to move from helping developing mutual interest in economic and social and cultural relations to a new status of real mutual interests? So with us today is a star panel. And actually, I think this panel might suggest to the administration the kind of people that could be drawn into a high-level advisory group on how to conduct economic, social, and cultural relations with middle-income countries. Just saying. We're waiting for Peter McPherson, who will join us. It's on his calendar, and we hope to see him soon. Peter was the aid administrator during the Reagan administration, where he successfully negotiated USAID around some very challenging political times. And he has one of the most distinguished backgrounds in this country. Chris Maloney is here, who is USAID's senior advisor on legacy policies, and like Cindy Huang and Steve Radelet, an alumni of the Millennium Challenge Corporation. He also has had wonderful experience as a consultant with that highly rated firm, McKinsey. Lindsay Coates, I'm sorry. After a decade of distinguished service, including being president of Interaction, the coalition voice of the international development nonprofit community, has just moved to BRAC, the largest and arguably the most creative nonprofit based in a developing country. She has a major global responsibility with that fabulous organization. Rich Bissell is a thoughtful, highly successful former assistant administrator of aid, and I believe our country's leading authority on international scientific relationships. Cindy Huang, the co-leader of a major program at the Center for Global Development on Migration and Humanitarian Policies, last week launched a huge amount of work on migration with a stellar program. Fabulous. And Sandy Ungar, who I believe is our country's top expert on international cultural relations, that is the nurturing of intercultural understanding. For example, a few years ago, he wrote a very bold and wonderful article for Foreign Affairs proposing that a significant proportion of undergraduates in the United States higher education system spend a year abroad. And batting cleanup, Steve Radelet, kind of a decathlon winner of policy work at state, aid, MCC, academia, and probably the only person to write a book on this subject that actually produced royalties. So I know because I've tried. So he has led this generation of policymakers to think about what happens next in U.S. relations with developing countries. So I'm grateful to each of you for being here today. We're going to start today with opening statements of about 3 or 4 minutes each by our roundtable colleagues, in which I would invite them to lay out a vision of what they hope will be the future relations between the United States and graduating middle-income countries in the areas in which they are most expert. Forget practicality for the moment. Give us vision, and then we'll talk amongst ourselves and later with you and the audience listening in on other issues. But first, I'd like to hear from Chris Maloney. Chris is leading the effort at AID to figure out legacy programming. So Chris, what's the state of play on this issue? How soon will countries be deemed to be candidates for graduation? What's the current thinking now on post-development aid relations?
Great. Thank you very much, Bob. That's a really simple question for 9 o'clock on a Tuesday. So thanks, Bill. So first, I'm just gonna make a disclaimer. I've been at USAID for all of 4 months. The administrator brought me over from MCC back in February, so I will not profess to be an expert on everything going on at aid right now. But I'm happy to give you a sort of state of play of where we're going on a couple of big concepts which lie at the core of the administrator's vision for where he wants to bring the agency, particularly on this question of legacy, or what we're starting to call strategic transition. And I'll talk a little bit more about why we're trying to call it that. The nomenclature does matter. As I'm sure you've heard many times, the administrator's vision is very clear. The purpose of foreign assistance is to end its need to exist. And at its core of that is this idea of what we're calling at the agency the concept of self-reliance and the journey to self-reliance. And what do we mean by that? Self-reliance is simply a fancy way of saying understanding the ability of every country we work with, whether it's at one end of the development spectrum or the other end of the development spectrum, its relative ability to plan, finance, and implement solutions to its own development challenges. This is a pretty big pivot. This is a pivot about really trying to understand where a country is at in the development spectrum and making sure that everything we do in that country is bespoke to that country and trying to move it along that journey to increasing self-reliance so that one day we can actually end the need for foreign assistance in that country. That's a big vision. That's a very simplistic way of talking about that. We understand that. But that's the goal of what we're trying to shoot for as we reorient ourselves around this idea. I think this is important also when we think about self-reliance because I'm deliberately trying to take the word income out of this. Steve, Cindy, and I, we lived and breathed this at MCC where, in case you don't know, MCC by law can only work at countries under the lower middle income, upper middle income threshold. It's a very hard and fast rule, and when countries bounce above it, that's it, you're done. And that is a very tricky way to work. And if you look at upper middle income countries, they run the gamut of all sorts of different types of poverty and other income realities. Same in LMIC land, as I used to call it as well. So it's an artificial way to think about the world if we're locking ourselves into this paradigm of strictly looking at the development spectrum in terms of income. So when we talk about self-reliance, we're trying to make the idea of looking at the development spectrum go beyond that income paradigm. And we actually, not to steal thunder from a presentation I'm doing next week, we're going to talk about this at length at the Center for Global Development. We're starting to define self-reliance on 2 axes. One is looking at what we call commitment. And commitment, if you're familiar with MCC, is all of the different types of ways of thinking about the policy choices and the cultural behaviors in a particular country that enable it to solve its development challenges. It's the types of things you'd see on the MCC scorecard. But aid, contrary to MCC, has to work with countries across different levels of capacities. It has to think about that as well. And so we're also thinking about self-reliance through the capacity lens. How able is a government, its civil society, its citizenry, its structure, its economy to actually enable the country to move along the development spectrum? So if there's a way that we can measure these 2 things, we think we can get at a much more nuanced and much more variegated way of understanding a country's actual position in the development spectrum and what we would need to do to better support it along its development journey. The reason I sort of wanted to tee that up is because this is at the core of how we're going to be thinking about the concept of strategic transitions. What I mean by that is if we're able to paint a picture of where all of our 110 so country partners sit on this journey to self-reliance, surely some of our current partner countries are already highly self-reliant. And so that begs 2 very different questions that we're just beginning to explore right now, and one reason why today I'm very much in listening mode because I'm curious to hear your thoughts about this. The first is how do you know a country is actually self-reliant enough, quote unquote, to actually transition that partnership, whether to a legacy or some other form of a partnership? Certainly we have a lot of metrics we can look at. We can look at a lot of qualitative information. But when you think about it, it can come in many different forms. I can think of a very high income, very dynamic economic country in upper middle income land. That might be one example of that. But I can also think of a country like India or Ghana who speak a self-reliance rhetoric. But when you look at the data, when you look at what's going on, might beg the question on why you would transition beyond a traditional donor aid recipient paradigm. So that's the first question we're looking at. How do you know a country is self-reliant enough? And the second piece is making sure that we move beyond this idea of a one-size-fits-all model for a strategically transitioned or /legacy partnership. So AID's done this before for decades, and so we are doing a very important inventory analysis of the range of different partnership models, transition partnership models that we have done in the past, and also thinking through what else we haven't done yet but might want to think about, and create basically a set of typologies that will allow us to understand what are the models that are out there so that when we identify a country as highly self-reliant, we have almost a toolbox of different models that we can develop to create the right bespoke model for each country, and moving again away from this one-size-fits-all approach. I would say two things. First is that the reason we're trying to move away from legacy as we talk about it is because many of these models are going to be much more than just USAID. USAID certainly will have a role to play, but this could be much more a role for USTDA or the State Department or DOD or something else entirely. So if we say legacy, that seems very USAID specific. And so we want to make sure that a transition partnership is one that is really a USG transition partnership. And so the other thing I would finally also say is we are making a very considered effort to really learn from, I think, dare I say in this room, the mistakes of the past we've done in this space. So trying to move away from the black box approach of, okay, this country is wealthy enough or at enough income level where we can just move away, but really have a transparent rubric for identifying a quote-unquote highly self-reliant country. We want to build predictability and analytical rigor in determining what the right partnership model is. And then most importantly, not just zeroing out a mission and exiting in 1 year. This would be something that we can actually plan towards over a 2, 3, 4, 5, perhaps even longer term period, laying that groundwork so you know where you're actually going. So these are the principles that we're building into play. There's a lot going on here. It is still very, very early days, so I can't underscore that enough. But these are the principles, the ethos that we're trying to build into this part of the Journey to Self-Reliance effort. So I'll end there. Thank you.
Chris, thanks very, very much. That was a wonderful presentation filled with interesting things. Let me welcome Peter McPherson here. We're now a complete roundtable. That is wonderful. And Peter, I was going to call on you next, but I'm going to call on a few other people. I'll give you a chance to listen in, and then I'll come back to you. Okay. What we're going to now ask is your vision, and let me start with Rich. You mind if I do that, Rich? You have led a huge set of relationships on science and technology around the world. What's your vision for U.S. science and technology relationships with, shall we say, graduating countries?
Thanks, Bob, and I appreciate the chance to share some thoughts today with this audience and hope that your questions will stimulate us to respond to some of your thoughts as well. So as Bob said, my experience is in the realm of science, technology, and innovation, what we shorthand call STI these days. And it has emerged as in its own right as a very crucial driver of the relationships between the United States and developing countries in a way that we have not seen since the 1980s. But in a very different format and a very different set of dynamics, which I just want to briefly allude to. And I could refer you to a lot of other work which has been going on currently that if you want to pursue the topic further. Let me just reprise for 1 minute of the 1980s, which was a time of what I call American triumphalism in science and technology. The emergence of the Green Revolution had a massive effect upon the whole issue of food security around the world and continues to present day. If I could editorialize, the point of lulling us into a view that there are no food problems. We won't know we have a food problem until there's a crisis. The second is that we had a tremendous proliferation of health technologies that continue to have major impacts in every aspect of human life around the world, down to the grassroots in developing countries. And if you look at changes in both the population area as well as communicable diseases, the technologies that came out of the United States have had a profound turning point in American history, in the world history. And I just cite those because one has to remember that it gave, I think, the United States, and particularly AID, a tremendous driver for thinking about how to frame the development relationship. And the payoff in terms of life expectancy, of birth ratios, of lots of other aspects that were really intrinsic to everybody's lives, were fundamental not just in the data, but they were fundamental in terms of changing the view of people around the world towards science, technology, and innovation. Now, why do I say that? And I say that partly because there were, and we don't publicize these a lot of failures in the area of STI over the years. And first, one hopes that they are, some would hope that they are forgotten, but I think one learns a lot from those. If you take something like the fact that American science determined the role of vitamin A in early childhood nutrition, and then developed the golden rice technology. Golden rice went nowhere. Partly because people cooking rice as a staple of their lives didn't believe that rice should be colored orange. Very fundamental. There were other things that didn't work in the past. I would hate to go through the generations, and it includes some people in this room, I think, who have gone through the recurrent innovations in the cook stove area. I still go into marketplaces in developing countries simply to see what the shopkeepers are selling in terms of cook stoves and whether or not they actually sell any. And yet we invested a generation of technology innovation in an idea which made perfect sense from our point of view, but required the adoption by people at the grassroots. More recently, technology of GMOs was what I call a push technology. And I can say, as a person who's worked most recently at the National Academy of Sciences for 20 years, that we can certify on the basis of scientists throughout this country and indeed throughout most of the world that GMOs are completely safe. They're safe both for human consumption and they are safe for the environment. And yet we have lost the GMO battle. They have been summarily stigmatized as frankenfoods. I expect that their future is very problematic, simply because the United States did not co-develop GMOs with other countries. They, in fact, came out of laboratories in this country and Western Europe.
Rich, would you
Yes.
just get to the vision part now? Just what's your vision of what
So
these future
the point is
relations
how to come up with an approach to incorporating a long-term relationship, not a donor relationship, but a mutual relationship with countries that no longer require the classic resource relationship with USAID. And it is, as Chris has already said, it is one that involves all of government. And the experience of the last administration was to expand intensively its ties with other federal agencies, technical agencies, in sustaining the Global Development Lab, which was an incubator for new approaches to middle-income countries. And if you look at the PEER program, the higher education, HESN program, the Grand Challenges program, at their essence was collaboration with other federal agencies and with outside players. And those partnerships were very important with philanthropies, with the private sector, and those can be expanded exponentially.
Great.
The second thing is that it became much more responsive to the use of STI in the marketplace. The marketplace is driving STI adoption today because the publics throughout most developing countries, in fact, love and embrace the latest in innovation. The whole M-Pesa system in East Africa, the coin-operated latrines, the whole adoption of health technologies across the board. This is a vision that is in hand and is growing beyond our control. It is not ours to drive and control anymore, but rather ours to identify where we as the U.S., and not just as the U.S. government, can play a role. The other part of the vision, yeah?
I'd like to just wrap up. and
Okay,
let other people
that's
say.
fine.
Can we do all right?
Yep.
Okay. I appreciate that, and these are just initial comments, and we'll come back for rounds. Try to hold your initial comments to maybe 3 or 4 minutes. Lindsay, civil society is under a lot of pressure around the world now. In a post-aid world, what kind of civil society relationships would you like to see taking place between the United States and legacy countries?
So that's a great question I put on my phone. So I'm going to try very hard to stay to 3 minutes, but I want to do some framing remarks. Very quickly, I think you have to remember when you think about U.S. INGOs relating to civil society groups outside the U.S., the common mission is not the U.S. national interest. It's not. It's poverty and justice issues. And that's problematic and difficult because local people will have different ideas about what poverty and justice issues look like in their context, and there are all sorts of risks of paternalism in those relationships. But that said, U.S. INGOs are fundamentally in those relationships thinking in that way. So that creates a political layer and makes it harder, I think, to define mutual interest. What does mutual interest look like in that context is very different. And so to sort of really jump quickly to what USAID's relationships with U.S. INGOs that are operating in developing countries, what needs to change there, given the complexity and the multi-layeredness of this, I really agree with what was said earlier about bespoke relationships, because that's really important. 70%, more than 70% of the world's poor people live in middle-income countries. And a lot of that's inequality, and a lot of that's political. And that's very, very difficult to say we're going to do it this way or we're going to do it that way. So when we talk about what USAID needs to do in relationship to INGOs, there are 2 things that are really important. One is that USAID needs to be more creative in how it allocates money. It needs to be less contractor-like in dealing with US NGOs. So it's much less a prescriptive relationship than what exists now. And politically, within a US context and with our Congress, that's really hard. It may be impossible, so I would say that's visionary. Then the other related problem is that most US INGOs get lots of money from the American public. So, 2/3 of Interaction members don't take USAID dollars. And many of them, most of their money comes from the public, from foundations, from other actors. So if that's the case, then we need to move more toward a mutual leverage kind of a relationship, which again relates to USAID being more flexible in terms of how it allocates money, how it aligns with the mission of the INGO, which is also answerable both to a US domestic constituency, which might not agree with our government, and also with a constituency within a country, which might not agree with what they think the U.S. national interest is. Because you couldn't go to Oxfam and say you're an extension of U.S. national interest, and you couldn't go to You couldn't go to Episcopal Relief and Development, for example, and say they're an extension of U.S. national interest. What they see themselves as is American Anglicans who are tightly related to Anglicans in Africa. And that's just a different paradigm. So my vision would be for USAID to become much more flexible in terms of how it works with partners, and may be willing to take some more political risks.
Thank you. That was great. Peter, can I call you on you now? You got it. Okay. And Peter, let me just say that you now represent a very significant proportion of higher education, and you've helped numerous poor countries around the world develop their higher education systems. So particularly on U.S. education, what would you like to see the relationship develop between U.S. higher education and countries graduating from aid?
Let me cover that. Can I go a bit beyond that? I'll keep to my 3-4 minutes.
Go for it.
One, I think that it's important to have some focus on the countries we're discussing here. But many of the things that we might be talking about for these graduating countries are also very applicable to other countries. Because the aid complex, what we do is changed. It is such a different world than I ran aid in 1980s, with the inflows of capital, with information technology, cell phones, works. So I think in many ways, as we think about this group of countries, we really ought to be also thinking about how the rest of the aid program operates, at least in some part. I think that the role with these countries is human resources, science and technology, including the health, the security, the whole range of things, and is the private sector. I mean, there are probably more, but those are my broad categories. I'm in no way taking away from the excellent and important work that the NGOs do, particularly with their own private resources. I think it's of huge importance. Let's take the human resources. Well, we educate in this country millions of students from abroad over time, and I hope we continue to do that. It's getting a little harder. Our numbers are dropping some this last year. But it's a key component of things, and it's, in my view, programs, the long-term training of AID and the Fulbright program and so forth. All these are very important that we haven't done as much of as we used to, and I think that programs of the U.S. pay for it in our ability to engage. So the universities abroad need assistance. There are like 4 times more students, higher education students in Africa today than 25 years ago. Some of you have been to these schools. They're just, so there's a bunch of help that we can do there. But in the end, it's about people. The science and technology, Rich has worked on this for so long, including back when he was at AID. There's these scientific connections with a growingly sophisticated group of people and countries are key, and they're exploding in terms of our universities. Our relationships with Brazil is a mature relationship, and so much else. And there's just some excellent scientists in Africa. So that's a relationship that we should, and I say again, it's not just with more developing countries. It is, in fact, across the board. We know about the health problems. We got to collaborate for the epidemics, all this stuff. We got to build all that. The security concerns, all these things are real. There's a set of relationships that aren't just AID, of course, but beyond. The private sector is interesting. Some of you know I ran Bank of America's Latin American operations for a period of years, and have remained active in various banking issues. I think we need to be cautious about too much expansion of the U.S. government in credit relationships. My first job at Bank of America was to renegotiate the $8 billion of bad debt we had with Latin America in 1989, and we took over that portfolio. And I think that we've got to be careful. I've always been a little critical of the IFC, who basically makes their money in countries that don't need to have outside, they get plenty of capital on their own. OPIC has to be careful, in my view. This new structure we're talking about, we don't, and always remember, debt has to be paid back, and currencies fluctuate. So we should not get too carried away about this relationship as being key. Money will find opportunities
Very interesting. Thanks, Peter. I appreciate that. You mentioned health, so let me now switch to Cindy, because Cindy's in a growth area, unfortunately, like migration, humanitarian assistance. And we also have these huge investments in international health. So what should happen to those relationships and interests after an aid mission closes?
Thank you so much. First, thanks so much for this invitation to be here with a very august panel on a very important topic. So I would echo what Chris said about income not being a determining factor in terms of need, and I think just it's pretty obvious when you look at countries like Yemen and Venezuela that are middle income. Currently Syria, which was middle income before this grinding civil war. So I think in some ways these are countries that need assistance because that journey to self-reliance has been interrupted. And of course we know very well from a number of studies, and most recently the big initiative around the New Deal for Fragile States, that it's not just income that leads to capacity and longer term success. So what is my vision? It is that we maintain this flexibility, as Lindsay said, and I think one thing that is maybe visionary at this moment is that we have to work very conscientiously in an increasingly multilateral way, because in these countries we're going to need not just, of course, the USG, even though in global health the USG is the leader, but I mean, if you think about the responses that are required today around the refugee crisis, et cetera, we're going to need kind of all hands on deck. What do I think that means practically? I would use similar language that Chris did around having a toolbox approach, because I do think that's necessary, and that's where the multilateralism comes in, because when I provide examples, you'll see that they're very difficult for the U.S. to do on their own. So first, in terms of humanitarian health crisis response, I think we're seeing innovation around things like the pandemic facility that's hosted by the World Bank and just released its first grant around the Ebola outbreak. And so you see kind of insurance, so using private sector thinking. I think that can both include private sector money or just the thinking around insurance, which is how do we set transparent benchmarks for the release of these funds. I also do a lot of work on the World Bank's refugee facility, which is new for middle income countries. So countries like Jordan and Lebanon, mostly through no fault of their own, are hosting 1 million or more refugees and saying, you know, this is affecting our own development trajectory. So what are, again, the mechanisms that we're using to be able to respond to those? When it comes to prevention and preparedness, I have to say I'm not quite as hopeful on the conflict side, because I think that's very difficult and we'll always have to, yes, I think we should invest more in peace building. That's been a lot of Stimson's work, but I think we also always need to be prepared for response, because sadly we're not seeing an end to war and conflict. But I do think on the prevention preparedness side, you are also seeing the disaster risk insurance, especially, you know, with a lot of momentum from the climate space, where that's not only for the response later, but it's creating pricing to incentivize investments that will mitigate the need for response later, or so when there is a natural disaster, because you've built the infrastructure that can withstand it, that the price later on is reduced. And that's very relevant for middle income countries, and you can imagine where you can subsidize the premium up to a certain point, but there is a graduation from that. There's a point at which middle income countries should be able to pay those premiums themselves. And then just one last point on the health that's not health crisis related. So I have to do a little plug. There will be a forthcoming CGD paper that looks at all the major health financing streams, everything from Gavi, the Global Polio Eradication Initiative, to the Global Fund, to PEPFAR, and look at their graduation criteria and see how does that play out over the next, I think it's about 40-year period. That's written by Rachel Silverman. And what's very interesting to see is that you have, it's really just a handful of countries that will experience a bunch of transitions at once, and a huge factor will actually not even be the graduation criteria, but the upcoming real allocation of PEPFAR as they focus on epidemic transition in a few countries. And with flat foreign assistance numbers, that means some countries are going to get less. And so I think I learned from Steve Radelet not to use the word comprehensive when we were writing the Feed the Future guide, because he said, you can't do everything well, so let's be selective. And I will never forget that. And I think this is a case.
Steve has taught us all along.
Exactly. And this is definitely a case where I think instead of having some kind of all-encompassing process, just look at those few countries where it is really going to have an impact and have those real partnerships. And I learned this also from Steve and Chris in terms of the MCC model, a kind of tit-for-tat approach which says we're going to reduce by X amount unless you do Y is just not going to work. And especially these countries in middle income status are not going to respond to that. So what can you do? I think without expanding MCC's remit to health, I think you can use the model to say there are joint processes, analyses, again, that have to be not just the USG, but more broadly, to think about how can we think about the domestic resource mobilization conversation where countries do need to pay for more of these essential services, but do it in a way that includes results-based financing or an incentive system that makes sense for the maturity of the relationship that it is.
Super. Thank you very, very much. Sandy, you don't often get in a discussion like this, and you should, because it's not just the relations of governments to governments, it's the relations of people to people and understanding people to people. That's an important part of moving to the mutual interest world with middle-income countries. So what's your vision? What would you like to see happen to deepen our understanding, people to people, with middle-income countries, particularly those that are going to be graduating from aid?
Thank you, Bob. You're right. I don't usually get invited to participate in discussions like this, and I was intrigued when you asked me to be a part of it and wondered what I have to contribute. So it is true that I spent a certain piece of my career as a president of a small residential liberal arts college, working on something not unrelated to these issues, which was how do we, as we're educating young people for citizenship and for responsibility not only in their own country but in the world, how do we introduce them, a larger percentage of people, to the world? I start out with the quite alarming statistic that there are a lot of rival statistics available on this topic, but I am convinced that not more than 1.5% of American college students actually have an international experience, which is, and that this is still true, is totally, to me, totally alarming and worrisome. Some people, there are different ways to calculate it. There are, of course, no central data banks on this. Some people might go as high as 10%, but I think they're wrong. But even if we say 10%, what a situation to find ourselves in at this stage as in our national life. Everybody around this table needs a larger percentage of people than that to understand what they're about and what they're doing. How did we used to learn about the world? We learned in a very simplistic but sometimes comprehensive manner about, it's still a problem with Americans of all ages knowing where countries are, something as basic as that. And the National Geographic Society still does these annual surveys and comes up with totally, not just alarming, but laughable results about what people don't know, can't identify countries on a map, etc. But even going beyond that, we used to depend upon an interest in international affairs in various ways among journalists. And there was a time in my career when I was hired for a job because I knew more about the world than other people working in that organization, and it was a pretty alarming context that I came into. So today, while there is more of a will among mainstream journalistic organizations to know more about the world. There's been a rebirth of that. At the end of the Cold War, a lot of American news organizations shut down their bureaus overseas because this was not a need anymore. We fought it, we won, it's ours, so now people will just do what we ask them to do or tell them to do. There's a rebirth of interest, but of course the finances of the mainstream media are just terrible. And there's another gigantic story, the elephant in the room that we won't talk about today in our national affairs that is, commanding a lot of resources. So how do we go about it? And if colleges and universities don't accept this challenge, who else will? I actually believe that college is almost too late to start teaching people more broadly about the world, but it's what we've got at the moment. There are exceptions. There are a lot of, non-governmental sort of private sector organizations, something like Rotary International, which a surprising number of people know very little about in this country, does more to educate people in small towns, big cities around the country about the world than anyone else. And that it's not recognized and honored for this is an amazing fact, but it's really an important thing. Rotary International has done more to eradicate polio, for example, than virtually anyone else. When I was director of the Voice of America, our main partner in trying to inform people about polio was Rotary. Not the U.S. government, but Rotary. But over a period of time, partly out of my own personal experience, not really time for that right now, I came to believe in the dream of universal study abroad as a way to. Now, what do I mean by universal study abroad? If a third of American college students studied abroad in some fashion or another, that doesn't sound like universal, but that would make a huge difference in the capacity of the American public to understand, to show an interest in the world. And there's lots of evidence that when one person studies abroad, her family learns about the world, her children learn about the world. There's a tremendous multiplier effect. It's doable. From my experiment at a small liberal arts college, people from all different backgrounds, we came to require study abroad over the dead or twitching bodies of some members of the faculty. But we required study abroad and granted, maybe 6 exceptions a year. That's it, and usually for reasons of mental illness or something. There's tremendous opportunity out there in the very group of countries that you're talking about here. People not going to the same old European destinations. The way to do that is sometimes with short programs. People sneer at short-term study abroad programs, 3 weeks, 4 weeks, a summer, month or two. In fact, that's a great way to introduce people to the world. I went along with some of our students at Goucher to some of these short-term programs. It was amazing. I recently wrote a piece called My Emirates Are Awakening, telling about a night at the Golden Sikh Temple in Amritsar and learning things I never would have learned any other way. So I think this is an issue that transcends politics, transcends economics. There are ways to do it, and we have to get going or things will get even worse for us.
Thank you, Lindsay. That's very helpful. I'm glad you're here. Batting cleanup.
Yeah.
Steve Radelet. And what other areas of mutual interest deserve some vision that we might not have touched upon? And what else would you like to just generally say, because you're a guru?
Thanks. Yeah, not much to clean up, actually, after everybody else. But thanks for having me. I want to just step back, big picture, about why we're talking about this phenomena, and just remind us where the world is headed in some of these big trends in what we still call developing countries, for better or for worse. One is a tremendous increase in incomes. And incomes are not everything, but they matter a lot. For developing countries as a whole, average income has doubled in real terms per capita over the last 20 years. That is an enormous change with incredible implications. Nothing like this has ever happened in the history of the world. So incomes are much higher. There's been tremendous amount of social progress in education and health and all kinds of areas related to that. There's much greater capacity within developing countries. Far more people that are well trained, that can do things that they weren't as well able to do 20 or 30 years ago. Largely much better governed, not in all countries, but in the majority of developing countries. They're better governed with stronger leadership and clearer ideas of what they want and where they're going. And with that, especially derived from the income side, much higher revenues. The largest source of development financing in the world by far now is government revenues in their own country, and not just by a little. Here are the orders of magnitude. Revenues in developing countries are now 35 times larger than foreign aid. 35 times larger than foreign aid. Government revenues in developing countries are now twice as large as FDI remittances, foreign aid combined. You combine all those things together, and local government revenues are double that amount. And they have doubled as incomes have doubled in the last 20 years. So countries have far greater financial capacity. So that's a huge change. We still have Cold War apparatuses that we're trying to engage in countries when the relationships have changed dramatically. That's one big set of points. The second is the United States needs to remain engaged with these countries in deep ways for our own selfish interests. For our own selfish interest. I'm not even going to talk about for moral reasons or ethical reasons or to fight poverty, because that is self-evident, at least to me, but for our own selfish reasons in terms of improving global security, in terms of fighting trafficking networks, in terms of fighting pandemic diseases, in terms of fighting climate change, and a whole lot of reasons. We need partners out there, and we need to take advantage of the fact that these countries have greater capacity. That's good for us because we can work with them and they can be helpful to us. Not just we helpful to them, they can be helpful to us. So we need to do this for our own selfish reasons. We also need to do this because there is a competition for ideas right now, because as we are receding from our global leadership role, other countries called China are increasing that global role. And there is a competition for ideas out there. So we need to continue to engage in countries for our own very selfish interests. So how do we do that? Well, we need to shift from a rather paternalistic attitude to what others have talked about, to moving into areas of mutual interest. And we need to take this talk about partnership and mutual interest seriously, because we've been talking about it for a decade or more, and we don't really do it. We still treat countries in a very paternalistic relationship of telling them what they need and how we are going to help them along the way. So part of it is attitude. A lot of it is around language. Part of it is that we need, therefore, to develop a bigger toolkit in a more serious way. Part of it is concessional financing for some countries that remain quite poor with very weak capacity, particularly countries that are in conflict or post-conflict. There's non-concessional financing. There's providing relationships with universities. I think one of the best things we've done over the last 40 years is bring people from other countries to be trained and spend 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 years in the United States. And I think that's been tremendous for a lot of reasons. We need to do more of that, not less of that. We need to do more on research and technology jointly, on health and on agriculture in particular. We need in some countries to have a security engagement. The type of engagement is going to differ by country, but we need to have this sort of a larger toolkit and portfolio, and then have the flexibility, as Lindsay mentioned, to use those tools in different ways, individually but also collectively in different combinations with different countries. That's going to take more engagement. It's going to take more time to figure out what those relationships would be. We need to be careful on our language. I'm not at all a fan of the self-reliance language at all, because it's kind of paternalistic, not kind of, it's very paternalistic. That there are countries out there that without us are not self-reliant implies that somehow without our benevolence they would collapse, which is actually true in a few countries that might be in conflict or immediate post-conflict. I've spent a lot of time over the last dozen years in Liberia, and immediately after the conflict, there was no security apparatus, and frankly, without international engagement, I think there was a question about whether that state could continue to exist, but not anymore. There are a few countries like that, but by most of the countries we engage in are, quite frankly, very self-reliant. They're fine, but we can help them, they can help us, and so I'm not a fan of that language at all. The whole idea of graduation is not driven by these countries have all of a sudden moved to some greater level. It's driven by we don't have enough grant money to give to everybody. Let's face it. It's because our resource is scarce. And if we had unlimited grant money, we would probably find reasons to continue to engage with all kinds of countries at different levels, because everybody loves grants, and we would love it too if we had unlimited amounts to be able to give that away. So the reason we talk about graduation is not because of them, it's because of us and because of our shortages. And that's the same reason why we can't do research projects with everybody, and we can't bring everybody for university, and we can't do security with everybody, because we have limits on our resources. So we have to face that is the reason why we're talking about this, and that makes us think about, okay, what is the right portfolio of tools, and how do we engage differently with different countries in ways that truly are of mutual interest, and move away from this idea that without us that they couldn't survive, and this idea that we are giving to them because they are giving to us and will continue in the future as we are, if we're serious about working on areas of mutual interest, which I think we should be and that we are. But this set of countries, what we would now call middle-income countries, has a lot to give to help us in terms of our self-interests in the world, and we need to really seriously think about that in a better way to keep that engagement and to treat countries with, frankly, the respect that they want and the respect that they deserve, so that they can work with us and continue to be successful partners in the years ahead.
Thanks, Steve. That was great. Well, just a few issues to be concerned about that came up in this last hour. I'm now going to switch to some fast questions to the round table, and hopefully you can give your answers in a sentence or so. I want to say then we'll go in about 26 minutes to questions from our Twitter folks, hashtags Stimson now, and the audience here. So, Chris, okay, we have legacy country. Is there anything left in AID's cupboard if a graduated country wants additional help on initiatives that AID helped to start, or if they find a new problem they really need help on but can't afford market rates? Gonna keep a little window open somewhere?
So I think this goes back to what we talked about before, is what is the right bespoke model for a country that is quote-unquote highly self-reliant, for better or for worse. I think one of the things that we're trying to do is by taking this very nuanced approach to understanding the different pieces of what defines a highly self-reliant country, where there would be areas of weakness, say, in the corruption space or in a public health crisis space, that you wouldn't completely exit from some of those sectors. So it would be very unique to whatever the specific issue is in that country.
Great, that's helpful.
Botswana would be a classic example of that.
Okay, great. Steve, by any chance, would you happen to know that if a legacy country would still be eligible for a Peace Corps program?
I happen to know somebody. So Peace Corps also has its graduation system. It's different and it's completely independent from AID's. As with most of these programs, they're quite collinear. There's a lot of similarities in who is graduating when. But Peace Corps makes its choices based on the resources it has available and the number of people it has, and how thinly or not they can spread themselves given the number of volunteers they can support. And then they look at the HDI, the UN's Human Development Index, and other indicators, but also take into account U.S. National interests as they get input from the State Department. Yeah. So they use similar metrics and similar kinds of ideas, and so there's a pretty pretty strong overlap of when countries start to move out, but it is an independent decision.
It's interesting. I just have to say, many years ago, during the Reagan administration, Lorette Rupe was the director of the Peace Corps, and I did a long-term strategic plan for her, which we agreed to implement, and then she was named ambassador to Norway because we had urgent foreign policy issues in Norway. But one of our concepts was that any country where we enjoyed good relations would be eligible for a Peace Corps program, but the question was the price. So Chad gets it for free, but Singapore gets it for double our costs so that we can make a profit. So if you want it, you can pay for it. So is there any consideration about differential pricing for legacy countries that anybody knows about? Might be an interesting concept.
I do, on a slightly related point, I do think that the implementing organizations are now going to have to switch over time to a model where the country pays for them directly. And if services they provide are that good, then there's no reason why the government of Indonesia or Brazil or Bolivia or South Africa wouldn't. They now have the resources to do it. So it's not quite that they would pay us, but I do think some of the implementing agencies are going to have to move towards their main client is not USAID. Their main client is the government itself.
Yeah, I mean, that's a...
I think it makes a lot of sense in the science and technology area. You ought to expect middle-income countries pay a substantial piece of what's involved. If, for another reason, if it's not important to them, then probably you shouldn't have the relationship, or you shouldn't try anyway. And we're seeing, and I think a lot of countries are prepared to pay for the equivalent long-term training. I mean, so I think that it also, when countries put money in, it becomes more of a partnership.
I just want to say, as a practical matter, I'm going to be implementing a program like that for BRAC. So the Targeting Ultra-Poor initiative, part of the revenue is going to come from approaching country governments and other INGOs to pay for technical assistance to implement the ultra-poor graduation process. So it's actually more of a social enterprise model, with sort of half the work being advocacy and half the work contracting with country governments to do ultra-poor as their social protection methodology.
Interesting, very interesting. I want to come back to this issue that was raised about the MCC and the current limit about not giving MCC resources to other than the lower part of the middle income. Is anybody thinking about trying to get that policy changed?
I hope not. I think that would be a fundamental, deep mistake.
Right.
I think the MCC has already crept too far in that direction. It's a limited number of resources. There are a lot of low-income countries that can use those resources effectively. And unfortunately, we haven't talked much about this, but as our aid agencies are pushed rightly to focus on results, one side effect of that is that pushes you to provide that funding to countries that have greater capacity, because it's a lot easier to achieve results in middle-income countries than it is in the poorest of the poor that really need it. And I am already worried that the MCC has moved in that direction. When it was originally founded in the Bush administration, they tried to resist that, but it's kind of crept that way. And opening that door wider is just going to provide fewer resources for the really low-income countries that could use it well.
Hence, the IFC's substantial involvement in these countries. It's hard to understand why you necessarily have to have a semi-government agency have a big role in getting money into many, many income middle countries. But, you know, by the way, it's where the revenue, a part of the defense of IFC. And OPIC has to worry about the same thing, actually, because you can make money in these countries.
That's right.
The other thing I would add to this whole debate is, of course, there's a fundamental challenge that I think MCC has, other than having challenges its middle name, as we used to joke, is that MCC is providing profound levels of grant assistance. And so the question is why would you give profound levels of grant assistance to a country that, in theory, should have the resources to not need that? So that's what. That said, MCC has this very unique scorecard model approach that is very hard and fast in terms of where it can and cannot work. And over the past 15 years, that scorecard has shown that basically of the world's low and lower middle income countries, governance is very sticky. MCC kind of knows where the world's best governed of the world's poorest countries are and has effectively selected almost all of them. So if MCC is to continue into the future, it is going to need to keep working with kind of the same countries in some form. And that is a fundamental question about what aid effectiveness and aid dependency looks like, how long a journey of development takes. So these are important and huge questions, but ones which are almost existential to MCC's model. And so one of the easy ways to think about this is, well, okay, if there's poor upper middle income countries, or what we were calling at one point PUMIC, Gail Smith hated that acronym. Poor upper middle income countries. Yeah, what does that mean? And so are there different types of tools, mechanisms, approaches beyond grant assistance if we were to think about that space, if that were to matter? But it's a huge question, and one that, I mean, from an MCC standpoint, would be profoundly strategically difficult and challenging, would require legislative changes, and so would be a way away. But obviously, an important question.
That's very interesting discussion on that point. And I do resonate to what you said, Steve and Chris, because I felt it wasn't a very good argument that some have made that the World Bank should continue giving loan assistance to China because it's such a good creditor and it helps the overall standing. Why not open a cash window at the World Bank?
Exactly.
So,
right.
Okay.
That's why we have Bank of America.
That's right. That's right. Bingo. Chris, what's the expectation that you and your colleagues have about what other OECD donors will do if the United States legacies a country?
That's an interesting one. In fact, as most of you probably aware, we're right now in the middle of the Tidewater Conference out in Eastern Maryland, which is when the OECD DAC, all the ministers meet together and talk. And right now they're actually talking about this question. They're talking about the self-reliance question. So I'll be curious to hear that readout. I think one of the things I've learned that's interesting is I think there is fear is probably the wrong word, that if the U.S. exits in some form or lessens its financial footprint, even if the diplomatic footprint or even the development diplomatic footprint is still strong, that the financial vacuum that's created, quote unquote, could be filled by them. And one thing that I've been interested in, of course, is this question of other OECD countries, quote unquote, playgrounds. So for political reasons, Spain always needs to be in Latin America or Mexico, or France needs to be in particular parts of Anglophone Africa, should they be highly self-reliant, that sort of thing. So how do we deal with that question? How do we get better coordination across the OECD? I think we are just beginning that discussion. But I think just like within the interagency, we also run that risk. I mean, there's a world where a state or DOD might go in to plug that gap too. Mm-hmm. So I think broadening the conversation beyond just USAID, and that's why, I'm not trying to be pedantic, thinking beyond this term legacy, because it is so USAID specific, is key. Because if we are to transform a relationship, this is more than just our little aid footprint. This is about really going beyond aid, which is out of our bailiwick, frankly. And so we need to figure out how you do that in interagency and, frankly, across donor way.
Very helpful. Peter, there was some discussion about China here, and our maybe lack of an answer to the challenges that they are giving. Are we going to have a polyester road to and it came very much to my attention day before yesterday when I was talking to Africa's leading economist, a very pro-U.S. African leader who advises a large number of heads of state in Africa. And I said, what is the U.S. role now in Africa? And his answer was, it is totally irrelevant to the big picture in Africa. So there was Tillerson's tilt to Asia a little bit, but not on the economic side. When you think about the bigger politics involved and the competition, does that have an implication to development relations that in your mind?
Well, I think some. This long-term training, this human resource component, I think is some part of this. I think these scientific relationships, all the things we've talked about, I think, play a role. Now, China's huge imprint upon Latin America and Africa is because they've got these resources. Frankly, history shows us that you better have a strong economy, or you're not going to be able to sustain a big presence. And I think this is something that we often talk about, learned ways here in Washington, but we don't do. So there's a back home question. All the other things all of us would like to do don't work unless we can get this. In my view, you can't have the debt that we're building up. We certainly need to grow. Anyway, there's that whole set of issues. I also think that we need to make substantially more investments in research in this country. I've got a session coming up. What I do now is I represent the association I run is the big public universities in the country. And we've got a meeting with the presidents here in a couple weeks. We do it twice a year. A major session is going to be comparing and contrasting U.S. versus Chinese research and development. In solar energy, we were basically wiped out. And there's something called G5 in technology. My good friend Dan Mote, who's over there at the Academy, was saying the other day, Peter, you keep on talking about G5, well, the Chinese are all deep into G6. I mean, I think when you look over the next several years, we've got to have the economy, we've got to have the technology, and that's where it's about. In terms of the discussion here, I think the points that Rich and others have commented on of human resources, of science and technology, all these relationships are important. But there's no immediate way to counter the huge money, and it certainly isn't to set up a big structure with government guarantees to loan them a lot of money.
Do you want to add a maraschino cherry on that one?
Actually, I would, because the question of China's emerging role in a data sense in the world of STI around the world is quite dramatic. They now graduate more engineers in their own universities than any other country in the world. And a growing percentage of those are from overseas. So they are providing lots of scholarships. The other side of the export is a different question, and in large measure, the Chinese presence in global S&T is still substantially where the U.S. was, say, 30 years ago, in the sense that what they export is turnkey technology. They build railroads and say, okay, here's the key. Build dams, that sort of thing.
Sometimes build the railroad in the wrong place.
In the wrong place.
We would never do that.
But
they didn't learn from our mistakes.
what they miss and do not adequately transfer is what we looked at long ago, which was O&M, operations and maintenance, that you have to have a domestic, trained, technical workforce. And the issue of middle skills in developing countries is an important one that higher education is starting to address. It also has to do with what I call the scaling issue. That is, they don't get into the more consumer level technologies where the long-term impact would be to be able to reach out and have indigenous human capacity pick up the technology and run with it. And those are key issues I think over time the Chinese will learn. They're smart, obviously, but it's not evident in their presence yet. And so it's one that actually we, I think in the U.S. would do well, and we do cooperate more with the Chinese on these issues. I wore today for our session the avian bird flu tie. This is a CDC picture of it, which was an episode, if you go back and look at that over a period of a few years, went from the Chinese ignoring the issue, trying to suppress knowledge about it, to starting to share data and now to collaborating, recognizing it's a global good, that we actually have the science and technology to respond to that kind of issue.
Interesting. Thanks, Rich. That was great. Sandy, let me turn to you. Pressure now on student visas, and which may account for some of the shift of students to China. If as part of graduation, is there some way that there could be a policy kind of signal set that your students now would be more welcome? We'll have extra visa people working. We'll somehow, give you an added welcome. Is there anything that is possible in that score?
Well, I feel you're asking the wrong person. I, of course, would advocate that, but you have to have people in the bureaucracy in the State Department believing that there is a different set of priorities, that there are reasons to, and of course there will always be mistakes, and mostly don't have particular consequences, but there could be mistakes with some. I'm straining for relevance here. The conversation about China moves me to say there is more or less as many students from China studying in the United States as there are American students studying anywhere in the world. And that's a very interesting statistic to wrap your mind around. So Chinese students have been getting here over a long period of time. It would be fascinating to see whether this administration tries somehow, as part of its toolkit, to reduce the number of students from China studying in the United States. It would be very grave development for some universities and some programs within certain universities if the flow of students from China were to be cut back.
Thanks, Sandy.
Just on that point, running a graduate program at Georgetown, we are running into more and more difficulty of students that are fully funded being able to get visas to come because of the limits on.
Which is, of course, ridiculous.
It's just,
I can't imagine what the justification would be for that.
I just want to suggest that maybe some dimension of an enhanced relationship has to deal with.
Oh, I think you're right.
And it's a kind of connection, one of many that we've talked about here, that shows what that we need to be experts in complexity theory and to help Chris in this. Let's move now to a few minutes on management of this. We've talked about a wide range of ideas and relationships that we'd like to see enhanced as countries graduate. We've built interesting foundations, relationships, NGOs, others. Who's going to manage that post-legacy relationship on behalf of the U.S. government? There's some talk, maybe Chris, you should tell us what your favorite ideas are about having a development representative on an embassy staff. One person, two people with all these interests. What's the practical management that you're thinking about?
Sure. Again, not to be a broken record, I would say it's going to be unique to each country, but I think we've seen a lot of interesting models that are out there. Obviously, on one side, you think back to some of the immediate post-Soviet funds that were set up. You sort of have these cross-U.S. country funds that have set up to do build enterprise. Again, if that's the appropriate thing that the country needs, that's one approach where it really is truly joint mutual. Sort of the MCA model is another example of that. I think this idea of senior development advisors that can still bring the heft of the U.S. development thinking and to the table in a country and be able to access SWAT teams and TA or whatever that the country might need is another interesting model that that folks are thinking about. I mean, particularly if you're looking at some of the transitional countries in Europe that are trying to accede to the EU, where they have massive envelopes to help them accede to the EU, but they need that arbiter at the table to help negotiate what they're going to do with the EU to make the needed justice reforms or whatever types of reforms there's a very key role to play. But the U.S. doesn't need a huge development footprint there to be there; just needs the right people there to be able to access, for example, the TA that the country could be funding. So there's a range of different types of approaches that are out there, but again, it's going to be very unique to what the country actually needs from a development standpoint from the USAID point.
It's important to have person that have enormous flexibility.
Yes.
We had a person in Mexico in the 80s who had about $10 million a year. Over half that was used in connection with family planning. But it was a very effective program. Now, it wasn't always strategic because it was right there in the basket, a lot of ideas. But it was some flexibility, a little money can go a long way.
Yep.
Let's talk about these various modes of management. Jim Michael, who was the chairman of the Development Assistance Committee of OECD, wanted to be here today, had been even acting administrator, I think, at one time at A. He mentioned the local foundation idea, which you talked about, but he talked about Costa Rica, Argentina, Portugal. What other options ought to, if you wanted to have a kind of a buffet line of options that you could tell an ambassador that when your mission leaves, here are a bunch of choices, and we have a handbook for you giving the pros and cons of these various options. What are the chapters in that?
You mean within the U.S. government or outside the U.S. government?
For continuing U.S. government and U.S. relations, really, on development issues. Lindsay, there was a time that CARE was actually given the Cameron aid program when aid was under pressure to cut down the number of programs, and so it was subcontracted out. I'm not sure that's the model, but it's anyway, but other people are talking about should we be promoting kind of clearinghouses for NGOs and foundations?
I mean, the Aga Khan Foundation has done some really interesting work on this subject about locally generated philanthropy and how it should relate to to other kinds of endeavors in country. I think one of the things, and this goes back to Steve's point on paternalism, U.S. NGOs are, as I said, are concerned with poverty and justice issues, and they're also having a sort of an existential moment about thinking about those issues in our own country. So Save the Children is becoming more active in places like the Mississippi Delta, for example. So I think that part of how we shift about in our thinking about this as a matter of vision is like, what is the mutual learning piece? So, for example, if there is a methodology for helping in a country where there's a lot of inequality, for helping women have safe births, and that methodology could be developed in India and taught in Yazoo City, Mississippi, what does that look like? So really thinking in a radically different way about how those relationships operate. And philanthropic vehicles might be a very interesting way to think about how to do that.
And a huge breakthrough to get people to accept the idea that things are thought about and developed in other countries that have something to teach us.
Right.
And I would emphasize, I think several people have mentioned that it's key to have that capacity to relate to these other innovative forms within the U.S. government still. So I do get nervous. I understand that the footprint will change, but I get nervous when we talk about withdrawing, which it sounds like that's not really on the table fully, because I think having a group of people at the embassy, whatever their title is, to deal with the USG coordination and then to relate to these entities is really important. And I think Steve worked on this, I think, when in the first QDVR, but it is recognizing development as an expertise, and there's not going to be a kind of a handoff to an economic officer, et cetera. So it's like, what is that capacity? Maybe it's bespoke still, where we can train people up both in the coordinating function and then as having really valuable technical expertise, which is relevant even when you're an upper middle income country.
I like that phrase, train people up, because I really think we're going to have some U.S. government capacity building to do, both in terms of the experts, but also in terms of country teams to understand what their responsibilities
right,
are.
yeah, and I think there needs to be a durable presence. If it's 1 to 3 people, however small it can get, but that's still very much needed in the country team.
Yeah. I think we're going to have to be best friends with the director of the Foreign Service Institute and other places to kind of think about this. Yeah, interesting. And now, just before we turn to the audience, I wanted to ask about whether, if you are in this new higher status relationship, you have an expectation that you will have a higher level of consultation with the U.S. government. You will have binational commissions. You will have special task forces. I think there are 27 in India now. You will have consultations that are led by an undersecretary or assistant secretary. So you'll be able to raise these issues and keep track of them at a political level that will allow that relationship. Does anybody have a thought on that about the kinds of signals we can give that say you really are at a higher status relationship? This really is a promotion.
Sure, Bob. In fact, there's an approach in place in the State Department for negotiation with qualified countries for a joint U.S. S&T agreement. And these are formalized cooperation agreements that are carried out at a senior level. Now, I say senior advisedly because it goes up and down with administrations and with which country that bilateral agreement exists. Indeed, there are now 65 such agreements focused on science and technology, and they have actually taken on life and really have content within them in probably a third to half of the cases, and the others are simply pieces of paper for the most part. But that provides a vehicle, and they, what the State Department has actually done is to reach out for U.S. institutions in some cases to help give content and manage those. So, for instance, in the case of the U.S.-Egypt agreement, we took that up at the National Academy of Sciences about 3 years ago, which involves actually organizing those joint ministerials between the two countries and so forth. So I cite that as one model, but that's just for STI. I'm sure it could be done across the board in other sectors as well as in higher education or whatever.
Please.
If I can add to that.
Please.
So I don't want to hold you too much to your words, but you referred to this as a higher level of status, and it's a different level of status. It is not a higher level of status, and in terms of greater or lesser U.S. engagement, I don't think that's going to be driven by the continuum that we're talking about here. I think that's going to be driven by U.S. national security interests. And we're going to have a deep engagement with Afghanistan, no matter where they are on this spectrum, for a long time to come. And we're not going to have much engagement with Brunei, or some other small country that might be higher on all of our development indices. And we do have this model of these bilateral commissions where we have very deep engagement with India, with Brazil, South Africa, and other countries, because they, in recognition that they are larger and more important countries at an international level in terms of our engagement. So that's going to define the level of engagement rather than kind of where countries are, I think, on the development spectrum. But what that does mean, though, I think, is let's think of smaller countries, Ghana, or say, a country that's been very successful in many measures, but is not going to ever really rise to South Africa or a Nigeria or an India in terms of. But we need to keep engaged. That's going to put a lot of pressure on the ambassador and the embassy staff and the others, not just at the State Department, in country, to have those discussions on an ongoing basis in the spirit of partnership. Not, here's what we have for you, but how do we work together in areas of mutual interest? And that's what those countries deserve and want, and that's what we want. So it's not, I don't think that necessarily means that undersecretaries are going to get involved, but I do think it calls for that different flexible level of engagement.
I agree with a lot of what you said, but I do think in a more pluralistic world, we're going to have to deal at the political level with more feeling of equity.
Yeah, although undersecretary's time is limited, and they're going to engage in the countries.
No question about
with
that.
the biggest national security issues.
I hear you.
Well, you've got the other agencies too.
Yeah.
For example, the USDA has a lot of relationships with their counterparts.
Yes.
That are very productive, I think.
Yeah. All right, we have just about settled every issue, and I just want to start the questioning, and somebody better feed me what's coming in from Twitter land as well. But I want to ask George Ingram a question. And George is our country's most distinguished expert on Capitol Hill and international development, and has been for 40 years that I know. George, what is the appetite for seeing these relationships evolve as you see it on the Hill now, and what risks are there in what we've been talking about, and indeed political opportunities, as you said? Just give us a reading on what the Hill thinks about graduation and these kind of issues. Is that too broad a question? Sure, but go ahead.
Only a fool would pretend to speak for the Hill.
Yes.
I have learned that. And what I will say is that from my exposure to staff and members on the Hill, is they are looking very positively at Mark Green's and AID's going down this strategic transition path. And they are looking positively on both the reorganization at AID, with some questions here and there, but generally positive, and at the path of self-reliance. And I think there are different perspectives on that. And I'm going to let this lead to a question to Chris, because it's a question I have. And that is,
in true Hill fashion, he will.
Yeah, good. Okay, I remember.
Ask someone else.
and that is, I think the issue is, what is the fundamental framework and rationale for the strategic transition process? And I'm quite enthusiastic about it because for 30 or 40 years I've been very perturbed by the fact that the U.S. establishes a 20 or 30 year relationship with the country and suddenly cuts it off. And none of the all those relationships between universities and science and technology and the private sector are suddenly just cut off. And there's nothing left to sustain those. I'm exaggerating a little bit, but not much. And so having a more strategic transition is interesting. Mark Green started talking about the need to end assistance to countries. He then started talking about a strategic transition to self-reliance, which sounds like a much different perspective than just ending assistance. And one concern that I have is in this whole conversation for 8 months, I've never seen the word ownership in that conversation. Now for me, you can't have a transition to greater self-reliance without local ownership. On the other hand, that term has been lost and leads me to be concerned that the real goal is just to end assistance rather than develop a more long-term relationship, I'm not sure what the right term is.
Different forms of engagement.
A more sustainable relationship.
Okay.
Of mutual respect. So we'd love to know where that word ownership and the concept of ownership is going.
Shall I try and take that on?
I think you better, because I'm not going to.
It's a great question, and I think one where, I mean, to be brutally honest, we are just at the beginning of our own journey of trying to really figure out the right transparent approach to how to do this. One of the things we'll be talking about next week at the Center for Global Development when we talk about this broader self-reliance metrics approach, which is also has its own strengths and weaknesses, because one of the things I do get increasingly concerned about is this dialectic that's evolved around, because we say ending the need for foreign assistance, the immediate thing you think about is it's all over, right? And similarly with these metrics that we're talking about, self-reliance metrics, and somehow like the MCC scorecard, they're going to be determining everything. They're not. So, I mean, there is this kind of fuzzy area. And I think one of the things that we're trying to do is, if we are able to talk about self-reliance by using these very, very specific areas that some of our metrics are going to be measuring, a lot of this will be talking about the level of ownership a country has in terms of its development journey, where its strengths and weaknesses are, and what our own relationship should look like with that country. And so when we see these levels of self-reliance increasing over time, one of the things we're thinking about is there'll be a set of countries that are already highly self-reliant, and we'd want to look closely at those relationships to see, all right, is the nature of this relationship the right one? What does that look like? And really, again, taking this very country-specific approach. But what I also think is interesting is that, okay, beyond that handful of our most self-reliant partners that are probably going to be maybe 10 to 12 countries, what about that next 20? What are we doing right now with those countries, with the nature of the relationship with that government, with the incentives we have in place, the mechanisms we have in place, to really transform that relationship over time to get there? Right, so I think that's why this strategic transition concept is critically important, because it's going to be very country-specific, unique to where the strengths and weaknesses are in the different drivers of that self-reliance profile, and navigating towards that over time. So that's the model that we're trying to shoot for, and one that I think is very much rooted in country ownership, because these are the various elements that are assessing how much the country is actually driving towards being able to manage its own development journey, if that makes sense. So that's, again, sort of a very high level where we are going, but it's going, it's going to be a bit of time before we can get a little bit more specific on what this is going to mean in practice.
Peter?
I think those are very important points. We have this structure of lines where you're in or you're out, MCC, a graduating country, whatever. But in fact, there's a whole range of activity that some of which should be applicable everywhere. And it does seem to me that aid and the world has changed so much that much of the discussion we're having here today is applicable to countries in which we have the traditional relationship.
Great. Do I see a hand? Whoa.
Okay.
Let's see.
If you don't have a question, raise your hand.
Just tell us who you are, and then, okay.
I'm Asif Sheikh. Have been in this business for a while and am happily retired. When I look back 20 years ago, we didn't imagine most of what is running the world today. I was speaking to a friend in Somalia early this morning, my time. I kept losing connection because of my cell phone towers in McLean. He had perfect connection and connectivity there. There are 2 billion people who use Facebook. What percentage of the world's working age population is that? So as I look forward 20 years, my question to the panel, and fantastic panel, by the way, thank you all, is will we have a leadership and representation based model of engagement, which is the right term in my opinion, or will engagement actually be in a very different form than it now is? We don't have a mission. It's going to be people to people. So let me just stop with that, because I think
I want this panel to keep notes on answers, because I'm going to take a round in which you give your answers and maybe your summary points. So do your homework. Other questions? Ready to go? Yes, ma'am.
Thank you very much. The question,
You are.
Pauline Muchina, I work with American Friends Service Committee, and I'm from Kenya. So my first question is, why is Peace Corps necessary if these countries are becoming self-reliant, for lack of a better word? And then the issue of China, you know, I think we only look at resources and we don't look at the dynamics that are making China successful in Africa. They don't have the colonial legacy that, you know, the Western world has. And they are not afraid to be seen as corrupt either. So they will buy the African leaders as much as they want. So there is need to look at those dynamics and see how you reshape it. And the role of faith-based groups in this transition, I would like to hear more about that.
Okay.
Thank you.
Let's try to do one question at a time. Steve?
Wonderful panel, and it's encouraging to see that these long-term investors, those of you at the panel, are still engaged, because that's going to be essential, and that you won't be driven out by some of the current state of affairs in the world, whether it's this country or otherwise. That's very encouraging. It's encouraging here. AID under Mark Green is planning to go forward with real plans. Let's hope that they're succeeded. That brings me to my real question is, a lot of us in this room and around the world spent close to 5 years developing a very different model for U.S. and other countries' engagement with each other for new kinds of partnerships, respect for individuals, dignity, change in governance, all called the Sustainable Development Goals, with a huge amount of energy and definition, and they're still being defined in terms of measurable outcomes. None of you has mentioned that. Maybe it's dead in the water in the United States, with the greatest pressures on development being climate change and movement of people, or not recognizing that it's not so much man-made war, but actually a difference in the style of governance and corruption that's causing some of our major long-term development success partners like Brazil, Nigeria, South Africa. People are moving from there to try to get out from under what's inequitable growth and opportunity. So you haven't really, you alluded to that, but those seem to be at the heart of what may continue to happen for the next 20 years. What happens when there continue to be 100 million people, not necessarily because of Syria? How can you build on that? What are you thinking to build on that huge investment to bring us to a global platform that had the chance anyway to define development with a different kind of partnership? Thank you.
You want to hand the microphone to the lady next to you? Okay.
Thank you. Vivian Lowry Derrick, the Bridges Institute, which focuses on strengthening African governance and democracy, and a great panel. As Steve said, it's just good to see these traditional, long-term, smart voices. So thank you. My question is about, excuse me, building indigenous capacity, because I'm assuming that that's the basis of what you're going to be doing. And
say that again,
building indigenous capacity, local capacity. And my first one was what George just mentioned, mine is civil society and how you're thinking about getting ownership of civil society. My second one is, I'm assuming that there should be a focus on education. Now, my example is from Africa, because that's what I know. But I don't see how this is going to work, given the paucity of education and the real inadequacies in systems. When you look at that new World Bank Brookings study, that countries really are not educating at the secondary school level, much less universities. And so how are you going to address that, and particularly the youth bulge, which is global, but in Africa, by 2050, more than 70% of young will be under 35. Thank you.
Thank you. You want to go over here? There's a question here, and then we'll come back for one final question.
Thank you. Let me just echo the thanks. I have a range of questions, but let me just ask,
Who are you?
Oh, Debbie Kennedy, I'm with FHI 360, but I spent almost 4 decades with USAID and just visited some MCC projects. And there was something special about the MCC projects when it came to ownership that as a longtime USAID employee, the way in which those were designed created a level of commitment that was really unique. Maybe just to follow up a bit on Vivian's question, I think a lot of you talked about different terms, mutual respect, and I think there's I keep thinking about what will be lost as we change, or what is it that we're most afraid to lose? And then how do we prepare for it, going back to, you mentioned the FSI. So I think as you go into a more sophisticated, less paternalistic dialogue, there are going to be changes required in terms of our diplomatic engagement. And how do we engage? You think about middle-income countries that want to talk about climate change or want to talk about issues that we may not feel comfortable with. And so what's the new way to train our Foreign Service Institute to instruct diplomats or development professionals? And then on the other hand, I worry about the closing space for NGOs and civil societies in a lot of these middle-income countries. And I don't know that being there necessarily stops it, but it makes it transparent. And so maybe just a comment about what is it, how do we develop new mechanisms for what we may lose if we think about a different engagement platform?
Thank you. All right, actually, there's 2 questions here. These got to be the last 2. 1 question each, please.
Thank you. My name is Alex Sadojevic. I work for the Institute for State Effectiveness, and I'm also an Australian who's a beneficiary of the US education system, so thank you for that. I will keep my question short. So basically, and for want of a better word, I don't like self-reliance either for a number of reasons, but are there examples of countries where self-reliance is not in US national interests, whether it is economic, political, social interests? So one of the things Steve mentioned earlier on was the fact that we're living in a world of competing ideas. And so I just want to know, are there examples where self-reliance, dependency, leverage, is not in US national interests, and what are we doing about that? How are we thinking about that?
I bet you have a country or 2 in mind, don't you?
Potentially.
Thank you. Great organization.
Hi, I'm Paul Cadero from the University of Toronto, but spent a long time at the World Bank. The panel has sketched out what I think would be a long view, and I think the foundations of it might be the U.S. role in multilateralism, which led to globalization, and an important element of soft power. At a time when both of those seem to be being challenged by the U.S. administration, and when, for example, a parent in Germany or Switzerland might not want to send their grade 11 to a high school in the United States.
That's right.
Or a university professor would say, I'd love for you to study at Stanford, but I don't think you'll get a visa. Can your long view be sustained? Is it resilient enough to last, say, 3.5 years?
Okay. Wow. Well, just a few issues. I'm glad we settled all the others. What I'm going to ask, and we're going to run a minute or 2 over, but if each of you would take 1 or 2 of these questions, and then we're located at a think tank here, and since we have solved all the other issues a think tank worries about, which is a miracle, but we would like to know, as you think about this discussion, what one issue would you like to see further study on? Something that's still really troubling you. And who's prepared to go first?
I'll go first.
Go, Sam.
Just quickly, I want to combine a couple questions. The issue of people to people and not just relying on I think the urgent need is for the doctors, dentists, lawyers, bankers, architects, artists, musicians, and above all teachers in this country to know more about the world and to participate in this conversation. I have great respect for everybody sitting on this panel, but we really need to branch out to a much larger number of people. It's interesting when you asked why is the Peace Corps necessary. I think one could make an argument about the Peace Corps in various countries, including Kenya, where I once lived. But right now, I think the Peace Corps, if we can keep it going, is necessary for this country as an educational device, which isn't a very idealistic way to put it. But I have a new friend who many years ago was in the Peace Corps in Colombia, and her entire life was changed by that experience. Her entire life. It's quite remarkable, and she's still involved in those things. So, and just lastly, Vivian, you know, I have tremendous respect for your knowledge about things in Africa, and we traveled together not so long ago to observe an election there. I think that a lot of countries are not interested in hearing us preach about building civil society right now, because we're not doing very well on civil society in this country, and that's a crisis of a different order. What I'm doing now, running this free speech project at Georgetown University, the crisis over free expression is not just in colleges and universities. It is in civil society, state legislatures around this country. We are in a very dangerous stage of shutting down free expression in this country, across the spectrum.
Anybody like to go next? Rich, for a minute?
So I would just pick up on the George's question about ownership triggered a few thoughts that I wanted to carry over to other questions. And it harkened back to that we may not have spent enough time talking about the ownership question and how this transition would be facilitated within developing countries themselves. I was in a meeting with some senior World Bank people recently who made an interesting comment because they have been working on this issue. And they spoke about the paralysis of decision makers in too many countries to actually make the kinds of investment decisions that are essential in defining these relationships, whether it's higher education or in science and technology or the economy. And it is interesting because we're in supporting ownership in part of the developing country governments, particularly in the political level. We're talking about very complex issues. I mean, let's just be humble here. I mean, our Congress has a hard time wrestling with some of these issues, given the kind of complexity of the issues. And so when we push this in developing countries, it's not simple. We were asked at the Academy about 15 years ago, 12 years ago, by the Gates Foundation to spend a decade facilitating the capacity around developing country governments to make decisions on adopting S&T. And it was a project, I'll be honest, Gates Foundation had very low expectations, but they were willing to put $20 million in it. And they were really delighted at the end of the day because it turned out that there was a way to facilitate intermediary institutions around the government, whether it's university people or whether it's civil society or whatever it is, to be able to advise the government in making these decisions that allow them to take ownership. Because if they don't have that capacity, they won't. So I just wanted to put that on the table.
Great, thank you. Anyone else want to go next? Go.
So I want to build on civil society and sustainable development goals and inequality. I think the reason I started with civil society in this country is interested in peace and justice issues, and it's also incredibly diverse. So you talk about bespoke. I mean, it's like make clothes for your child. It's very, very particular to the individual situation. That said, I think the SDGs were incredibly prescient in terms of saying they were universal, and in terms of taking on governance and institutions in goals 16 and 17. That was the first time development had been framed in that kind of a way. So I think it's certainly an agenda that's worth going back to. And when you talk to country governments outside of this country, the SDGs are considered a very serious framework for how to move ahead. I also very much agree with what was said about there's a broader crisis in civil society, and it's driven in this country and more generally, driven by all the things we're aware of, breakdown of the social fabric, technology, the economic inequality. So we've gone way beyond the 2 or 3 year framework that was very sensibly presented to sort of like the cosmic macro issues. But I think the SDGs are a good point of beginning and worth going back to.
Peter?
I'll be quick. One, maybe I say this bravely, but I'm confident about the long term. I mean, I don't think, I'm not trying to talk about who's elected and that kind of stuff, but I think the country will stick to our international engagement and role and welcome students. The forces to do that are enormously strong, even though obviously there's some contrary forces. I could tell you for sure that the public universities strongly feel this. I realize they don't control everything, but they certainly are a major force in arguing this case in state after state. My last quick comment is that I love this discussion because I think about it not just in terms of countries that are graduating, but the whole AID assistance area, which I really do think you can't segregate this off too easily. And I don't think we have a coherent and easily explained theory of how to do this. Now, I don't blame anybody for that. I mean, the explosion of cell phones and social media, I think, has changed this whole mix. But we haven't been able to lay it out and explain it. And I think also we don't know how to have the political capacity to allocate money differently. And I believe often discussions like this become interesting discussions, but it's hard to get traction. This question about graduation, shoot, there's no money for it. I mean, it's there, and we have so many, the good old days. Us old guys always think of good old days, Bob. But when we were at AID in the 80s, we didn't have these earmarks. We didn't have the individual interest groups demanding this and that. It was a different world. And until between the administration, the Hill, and the various interest groups, including universities, I might quickly add, there's no money left. Double the earmarks. Somehow or the other, we've got to get at this, or we won't have a new theory.
Cindy.
Yeah. Okay, most of you know I'm an optimist, but I'm very happy that I followed someone who's an even greater optimist who has confidence in the future. Because I was going to comment on some of these questions also around closing civil society space and just share a reflection, I guess, which is I do think we're in this challenging period for quite a while, and what I'm struck by, the linkage between kind of the challenges to human dignity and equality and the rise of racism and xenophobia and nationalism and populism, I think are really disturbing trends. And to me, there is a link to those forces and the ability to which we can really take this new approach, which requires individual and collective self-transformation, to say we are going to engage with African governments, African civil society, people around the world as equals in mutual partnership. So I think that some of these challenging trends will make that kind of relationship more challenging, not just because of the rhetoric of President Trump, but also you see the recent Italian elections, you see Turkey, the Philippines, so the challenges are there. So I will pose as potentially a research question, but just a quick, like, why I became an anthropologist is because I felt in studying development, it was a field that was born out of colonialism, but went through a really difficult reckoning and self-analysis, and I think is not perfect, but went through that struggle. So I guess my challenge to all of us is to think about understanding these very disturbing trends. What's what's the process of self-reflection. It's a very political process, I believe, that we need to undergo to reach the other side, and that's a process not just, again, among Americans, but among civil society and connecting to people around the world. And I feel that that's a very urgent challenge that we have to take on if we want to transform these development relationships in the way that we've been speaking of.
Very nice.
So I think the key on this is the partnerships, the areas of mutual understanding and mutual interests, which gets at the ownership issue, and again, taking more seriously wherever countries are in their level of development, what their interests are, what their priorities are, and how we can work together. And we've been talking about this kind of thing for a long time and still don't do it well enough. But if we're going to continue to be, if we, the United States, are going to continue to be a leader in these efforts, we're going to have to take this much more seriously. I have my reservations about the SDGs because when you have so many priorities, you have no priorities at all. And I actually hear from developing country leaders, when they engage with the donors, they love the SDGs, and when the door closes, they just say, everybody wants me to do everything. When I sign up for these SDGs, it's not my priorities, and somebody comes in here and says, well, goal number 143 says that you have to be committed to this, and I can't. So countries are feeling absolutely stretched that it's not their agenda, it's not their priorities, it's a set of things that were dropped on them that the international community expects that they're going to do. So I worry about that as just another mechanism where it's not really reflecting the country's own priorities. But in terms of the U.S. government, I think the challenge, just to kind of summarize again, is how we engage with countries and whether we are serious about engaging with mutual respect and an understanding that many countries out there can be helpful to us as partners, and really changing that discussion, and then thinking about this set of tools, whether it's concessional assistance or mutual research efforts or university grants or security or whatever it is, but really having those serious discussions and figuring out with our larger portfolio of ways to engage, how we can build those stronger relationships over time.
Thank you, Steve. Chris, you've been very gracious to be here and to listen to all this advice, which we gave you at a bargain price.
Yeah, coffee and donuts.
And I wonder if you just had a wrap-up comment.
First of all, this has been incredibly useful, and I seriously, this feedback is extremely well needed and couldn't be coming at a better time for us in terms of where we are with this project. I will say, and I don't mean it as a joke, a lot of the questions that have come up today, I think may be addressed, or at least we'll continue the conversation next week, 9:30 at the Center for Global Development. It's going to be entirely about how we are measuring the concept of self-reliance, and this idea of self-reliance metrics, not transition metrics, which is another thing I'm trying to move away from. So I'd encourage you to come to that, because a lot of the questions here we will be talking explicitly about that. There's two things I did want to hit on the two questions I thought resonated at least with me. One was, is self-reliance ever not in the U.S. interest? And I think that's a great question. I think what I would come back to is being very clear on what I mean by self-reliance. And again, the language point, this has been a debate we've been having inside the building for a long time. We can have many drinks about this. But I think the issue here is that self-reliance at its core is really about understanding a country's ability to plan, finance, and implement the solutions it needs to solve its development challenges. So if we are able to measure self-reliance, basically that is simply saying that if a country is highly self-reliant, in other words, it is highly able to plan, finance, and implement the solutions it needs to solve its development challenges, is USAID the right tool to be in there? So if a country is highly self-reliant, that doesn't mean the U.S. government should be going away. It just means USAID's role might be different. And there's a real world where, for foreign policy, security reasons, grant assistance is the right tool to have there. And yeah, maybe as an agency, we shouldn't be doing that. But at the same time, I also ask the right question that maybe Treasury should have a bigger role in that country. Maybe USTDA should have a bigger role. That doesn't change the USG footprint or how important that relationship is. It just makes a better use of resources. And that's really what I think we're trying to get at when we talk about the self-reliance piece. And last, I wanted to pick up on the capacity building piece. I think, to be crude about it, what we want to move away from is this idea of here's a set of money, educate 100 people to read. Rather, we want to say here's that same set of money, build the capacity of the Ministry of Education to get 1,000 people to read. That is what's going to push a country along the journey to self-reliance. So it really is about capacity at its core. But that's going to be very different from country to country. And one of the things we'll be talking about next week is how we can use some of these self-reliance metrics as an entry point, not a determinant point, but as an entry point to start figuring out where building capacity should and should not be when we look at a particular country, which then, of course, brings in a whole kettle of fish, which I won't address today, on earmarks and how we want to think about, can we have a dialogue in terms of getting and addressing these mismatches between what a country actually needs to become more self-reliant and where the money is actually going right now.
That was wonderful. Thank each of you. I just want to say, because I do not want to have somebody else's program as the last word of the next programming, is on June 19th here in the morning, we will have a session on trade policy with middle-income countries. And the point of this paper that we will present with a very excellent Hill and private sector panel is that it's one thing to have a policy, and the policy now is bilateral trade negotiations, and it is another thing to carry out that policy. So this is what we've been talking today, about having a policy but be able to carry it out. We have built a toolkit here, which takes 2 people to carry. It's so, and I think Chris is strong enough to do that. Thanks to each of you for being here. Thanks to this spectacular panel.
Thank you very much.